Hey, it's Eric Peterson, broker at Kopa Real Estate. In this video, I'm going to talk about the most recent statistics. We're going to talk about the rental market also, and then the seasonality of the real estate market, and then also talk about whether you should sell your house sight unseen or not. So let's get into it. The most recent statistics came out from the Austin Board of Realtors, and we've hit on some of this before. The couple things that we didn't really talk about were the number of closed sales was down 8%. New listings is up 8%, and that's definitely an important statistic we need to look at going forward. Active listings is up 4%, and pending sales is up 13%. So that was a really good sign leading into the beginning of the year that perhaps we are seeing the tide turning in terms of the demand. Now, if you have plans to put your home on the market, whether it's next week or 2 years from now, be sure to sign up and attend one of our 2 free home selling workshops this year, Saturday, January 20th at 9 a.m. at the Cedar Park Recreation Center, and Thursday, January 25th at 5 p.m. at Moonshine Grill in Avery Ranch. Now, nationally, we are seeing a uptick in the number of homes for sale, the active inventory, and that's a little unusual because usually we still see the market bottoming out now in January. We're not so much seeing that in the areas, most of the areas that we sell, but that is something that we want to look at going forward, because if we do see an uptick in inventory this earlier in the year, that could be a sign for buyers that you're going to have a lot more homes available for you as we head into the typical spring market when the active inventory typically does increase. Now, I took this slide from one of my favorite appraisers. He's actually out in California, but really the same thing could be said about our market. A lot of sellers think the best time they want to put the house on the market is June or in the summertime, because we see the statistics that come out. The sold data for June is usually one of the strongest months. But those are homes that went under contract in April and May. And typically what we look at for our market, the seasonality is after school lets out, we usually do see a little bit of a drop in buyer demand around that point. So here's what he's saying. And really the last couple sentences are very important. Also, sometimes you're just not ready to list your house between now and the end of the school year. That's okay. So my advice is the same: as you've got to do what you've got to do. Some of our people just, their timing when their next home's going to be ready, it's just not going to be ready until later in the year. That's fine. This isn't like a black and white total thing. It's just for the people who call me and say, when's the sweet spot of the market? Most people need to be pushed up in the air further than what they're expecting. Okay, we got some good news from the Home Builders Association. Every month they gauge what their, how their positivity is for the market in January. It's another month where it was uptick. But if you look down at the bottom, so there was an increase in confidence, but also many of the builders are having to cut prices or having to give more incentives. So that's a little bit of a strange kind of situation where they're more positive, but also giving more discounts. And of course, the builders can cut their profit margin a lot easier than you and I can as home sellers. Now let's look at the rental market. A lot of times at this point of the year, people come to me and they say, well, should I sell my rental property? Should I convert an owner-occupied property to a rental property? And I'm always open to having a conversation with you about that. A couple things to look at here. Median prices year over year for December were flat. In my area, they were actually down about 5% from last year. So this is these stats are coming from the whole city, the whole metro area, really. So flat to 5% down. I think most areas are probably about 5% down. And you got to consider taxes are up, insurance is way up. So that really is less money. The other important statistic is it's taking about 50 days in order to rent a place. So if you're a new landlord, this is always something that's hard for new landlords to wrap their minds around, that there aren't going to be 50 people waiting to move into the house as soon as you leave it or as soon as the previous tenant left. 50 days is a pretty long period of time, up 11 days. In the areas where I typically sell and rent, it's been about a 2-week increase. So you start looking at that 5% off, 2 weeks off, and you have to remember that your biggest expense as a landlord is having a vacancy. So that's really important. This information, this data is coming from Adrienne Loyosa, who's a local property manager. And then I want to talk to you about selling your house sight unseen. And there's a lot more that goes into this than just that. But I found it interesting. There was a local Facebook group somebody had made a post about whether or not it was important for the seller to know, whether they even have a right to know, if a buyer hasn't seen your home in person, right? And I thought it was very interesting that a lot of the agents were saying, it doesn't even matter. You shouldn't have a right to even consider that. The reality is this is the difference between a listing agent and a buyer's agent. Listing agents would never tell you that. It certainly increases your risk of having a buyer back out of a contract. And so you want to talk about these things with your realtor. And I do think that this is where a couple of weeks ago, we talked about 49% of agents didn't sell a house or only sold one house last year. And the real problem with that is not having this experience. And so those agents may just not have that experience to talk to you about the things that you should be thinking about, because many of the agents said, well, sellers have never asked me that before, so that means it's not important. And just because a seller hasn't asked me something doesn't mean that I don't have an obligation of explaining that and going through what your options are. So all that being said, we've sold tons of homes to buyers sight unseen. So it does not mean that you don't want to accept an offer. It just means that you really want to talk it through with your broker and go over what those risks are, particularly if you have somebody else who's also interested in the property. So, all right, thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and take care.